Continuing on from page 155, we see Mrs. Lynn respond to Nora's news about Torvald, saying, yes, it must be pleasant to have everything you need. Nora says, oh no, not just what we need, heaps and heaps of money. This language that Ibsen's using here is really interesting in two different ways. To start off with, it reflects a rather childish excitement from Nora's character, which is in many respects perpetuating um, the role that she's taken on as this infantilized wife in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. The other thing that it's doing is using language which we could consider quite naturalistic, which is also in many respects reinforcing the style of drama that Ibsen was creating here at this time. Mrs. Lynn continues by saying, with a smile, Nora, Nora, haven't you learned sense yet? Even at school you were a terrible spendthrift. And Nora laughs quietly. Yes, Torvald says I still am, but she wags her finger in much the same way that Torvald was wagging his finger at her earlier in the scene. But she says, but Nora, Nora isn't as silly as you think. We simply hadn't the money for me to waste. We both had to work. Now, again, here we get a bit of an understanding of Nora's understanding of her own place in a relationship and in society, and she's once again giving us the impression that perhaps she's a little bit more manipulative than everyone thinks that she is. She does seem to know what's going on. She does seem to be a little bit more intelligent than we first perceived. With this comment with regards to work, Mrs. Lynn has replied, you as well? And she says, yes, with odds and ends of needlework, crochet and embroidery and so on, casually, and in other ways too. You see, when we were married, Torvald gave up his government post. There wasn't any hope of promotion in this department, and of course, he had to earn more money than before. But he overworked dreadfully that first year, you see. He had to take on all sorts of extra jobs, and we worked from morning till night. He couldn't stand it. He was dreadfully ill, and the doctors said he'd simply have to go to the south. Oh yes, you went to Italy for a whole year, didn't you? Yes, we did. It wasn't easy to manage, I can tell you. It was just after Ivar was born, but of course we had to go. Oh, it was a wonderful trip, beautiful, and it saved Torvald's life. But it cost a terrible lot of money, Christina. I'm sure it did. $1,200, 4,800 krona. That's a lot of money. Yes, at times like that. It's very lucky to have that money. Well, you see, we got it from Papa. Oh, yes, I remember. Your father died just about then. Yes, just then. And just think, Christina, I couldn't go and nurse him. I was expecting Ivar to arrive any day, and there was my poor Torvald dreadfully ill, to look after. Dear, kind Papa, I never saw him again, and that was the hardest thing I've had to bear in all my married life, Christina. Here, we start to learn a little bit more about Nora's character. In a previous scene, we've seen that Mrs. Lynn has had to be quite determined and quite resilient when her husband died, leaving her and her 3 children with nothing. But we've seen, in many respects, that she almost looks at Nora as being quite innocent, not having suffered as she has. With this scene here, we're starting to understand that Nora's had to endure quite a bit as well. Okay, so she's had to show a level of resilience. You know, her father is dying, her husband is ill, she's pregnant and expecting a first son. All of these things are happening at the one time, and she was the one who had to actually deal with everything. If we keep going, we see that Mrs. Lynn responds, I know how fond of him you were, and so you went to Italy. Yes, we left a month later. We had the money then, and the doctor said there was no time to lose. And when you came back, your husband was cured, fit as a fiddle. But the doctor, what doctor? That man who arrived at the same time as I did. I thought your maid said he was a doctor. Yes, that was Dr. Rank, but he doesn't come here professionally. He's our best friend. He always looks in at least once a day. No, Torvald's never had a day of illness since. And the children are all well and strong, and so am I. Jumping up and clapping her hands. Oh, Lord, Christina, it's so wonderful to be alive and happy. Oh, but how awful of me. I've just gone on talking about myself. She sits on a footstool beside Christina and puts her arm on her knees. Now, you mustn't be angry with me. Tell me, is it really true that you didn't love your husband? Why did you marry him then? Before we get into this section here, looking back, for starters, we get a reinforcement of who Dr. Rank is, even though we haven't met him yet. So we've already established that he visits very often, but now we get Nora's confirmation of that he's their best friend. We also understand that this trip that they took to Italy is something that was really important for Nora in the family in general. So it's saved Torvald's life. It's something that he really needed, as the doctors have mentioned, to alleviate his stress that he's built up across that year in terms of overworking himself. But now, clearly, they are quite well to do. They're better off than they were. This stage direction that we have just here, again, just like the clapping of earlier, it's almost reinforcing a childlike behaviour. It's almost as if it's been conditioned into her, having to act as the subservient wife to Torvald for all of these years. So little things like this that we see all the way throughout perpetuate that idea of the infantilized woman in the 19th century marriage. Moving along, Nora's just asked this question about Mrs. Lynde, the fact that she didn't love the husband that she married. And she asks her quite blatantly, why did you marry him then? Mrs. Lynde responds, my mother was still alive. She was bedridden and helpless, and I have my two youngest brothers to look after. I didn't feel I could refuse his offer. No, I suppose you couldn't, and he was rich in those days. I believe he was quite well off, but his business wasn't sound, and when he died, it went to pieces, and there wasn't anything left. So a really interesting indication here is this role that Mrs. Lynde has had to fulfill of being the dutiful woman. Okay, much like the situation that Nora's found herself in here, she had a bedridden mother, she had two younger brothers to look after. This idea of marrying for security is actually the best thing that she's had for her. So a really interesting relationship that these women are forming with their husbands, one of more subservience and duty rather than their own independence. Continuing on, Mrs. Lynde says, well, I just had to struggle along. I ran a little shop, then a small school, and anything else I could turn my hand to. These last 3 years, I've never seemed to have stopped working. Still, that's all over now, Nora. Poor mother's gone. She doesn't need me any longer, nor do the boys. They're working, and they can look after themselves. Nora replies, how relieved you must feel. No, just unspeakably empty. I've no one to live for anymore. That's why I couldn't bear to stay in that little backwater any longer. It must be easier to find some sort of work here that'll keep me busy and take my mind off things. If only I could be lucky enough to find some office work. But Christina, that's terribly tiring, and you look worn out already. It'd be much better for you to go for a holiday. And she replies, I haven't a father to pay for my fare, Nora. So at this point, Nora still hasn't confided in Mrs. Lynde about the fact that the money is her big secret. Before we go on with that, though, we've got this section here where we learn about and see this new working woman of the 19th century emerging, particularly after countries like Norway were progressing out of a purely agricultural base and moving to a more industrial setting. People like Mrs. Lynde are far more likely to be able to go out and work, but it's obviously something that she's had to do. She's had no other choice. And this image, I guess, of a working woman is very contradictory with regards to how someone like Helmer wants to see Nora. He just wants her to be, this pretty wallflower in his relationship. Very, very different stance to what Mrs. Lynde has had to take on. We move on just a little further, just to see the revelation between Nora and Mrs. Lynde. Nora rises and says, oh, don't be angry with me. No, Nora, it's you who mustn't be angry with me. That's the worst of my sort of life. It makes you so bitter. There's no one to work for, yet you can never relax. You must live, so you become self-centered. Why do you know? When you told me the news of your good fortune, it wasn't nearly so glad for your sake as for my own. But oh, I see what you mean. You think perhaps Torvald might be able to do something for you. Yes, I thought he might. Oh, he will, Christina. Just leave it to me. I'll bring the subject up very cleverly. I'll think of some wonderful way to put him in a good mood. Oh, I should so like to help you. It is kind of you, Nora, to want to do this for me, especially when you know so little about the troubles and hardships of life. I, so little. Nor, and Mrs. Lynde smiles. Well, good heavens, a little bit of sewing and that sort of thing. You're only a baby, Nora. Pausing there. In spite of the fact that we've got two women who are quite strong, quite independent, who had to endure quite a bit, we do see here, again, a little bit of that patriarchal dominance and the fact that they are still having to rely on Helma in order to secure a better type of work for Mrs. Lynde. So it's this interesting play that we get between the strength of the genders all the way throughout this text.